Viviette, hello. This is my first take of my dry run at recording my talk for DevGAMM 2020 Moscow. While I'm disappointed to not be able to be in Moscow personally, still excited to give this talk. To introduce myself, my name is Mark Barney. I'm Vice President of Operations at Firefly Studios. We are most well known for the Stronghold series of games, Stronghold Crusader, and coming this year, Stronghold Warlords. I am the lead producer on our MMO RTS title, Stronghold Kingdoms, as well as our forthcoming MMO RTS Romans Age of Caesar, which is currently in Alpha 2. So I stay busy. But one of my passions is localization, believe it or not, and although it can be a somewhat dry subject, if you're here listening to me today, I'm hoping to make it a little more interesting and kind of let you know how localization can impact your product and how you can manage costs and quality while still pleasing your fans. And we're also going to talk about just some of these buzzwords you might hear, like translation, localization, globalization, internationalization, and what all of those mean and how they affect our products. So I'm excited to get started, so let's get to it. I'm going to start us off with a quote that I'm rather fond of. This is one that I remember from my business German class at university, and Willy Brandt, the former chancellor, famously said to one of the English-speaking trade ministers, he's like, if I'm selling to you, sure, we'll speak your language, but if I'm buying, dann müssen Sie Deutsch können, which of course means you must be able to speak German. And this is a great example because it illustrates a lot of points, and that's probably why it's stuck with me for so long. We have to understand our customer and be able to deliver something that they can understand. And for us in entertainment industry, where we're delivering something that's a little bit more abstract than, say, razor blades or cleaning solution or toothbrushes, that requires adapting our art a little bit, which means that some things can be extremely difficult to localize, if not utterly impossible. One famous example that comes to mind is the popular American television show The Simpsons, which I'm fairly certain everyone has heard of, was unsuccessfully attempted to be localized for the Arabic-speaking market. However, Homer, being somebody who loves pork chops and drinking Duff beer and going to Moe's Bar, this presented certain cultural problems. So the show was changed around quite a bit to make Homer Omer, and he enjoyed drinking Duff soda pop and going to Moe's coffee house and eating Egyptian beef sausages. So it lost a little something in translation and didn't do quite as well as they had hoped. So that's an example of where some cultural differences you might not be able to overcome. But luckily for us, with games, we've got something that engages directly with the consumer. So we have it a little bit easier. But there's still certain considerations that we also have to take into account when we're trying to bring our product to those markets. One example from our own work on Stronghold Kingdoms was entering the Chinese market, which because our game worlds are based on contemporary geographic maps with contemporary borders and names, we were reluctant of running afoul of anybody or causing any controversy, so we tried to name our provinces and distribute everything into nations and provinces and whatnot as diplomatically as possible. So this is just one of those other examples of how cultural considerations can come into play when we're talking about localization. So in that sense, it's more than just language and it's more than just translation. So that's one reason we localize, the purely commercial. The next reason that we localize, another quote, when you talk to a man in a language that he understands, that goes to his head. If you talk to him in his language, that goes to his heart. Or, in Russian, если вы говорите с человеком на языке, который он понимает, вы обращаетесь к его разуму. Если вы говорите с ним на его языке, вы обращаетесь к его сердцу. Sorry, I've only been speaking Russian for a few weeks. I hope that wasn't terrible. But hopefully, since I know a lot of us are native Russian speakers, that this illustrates why exactly we localize. It's a lot more meaningful when it's in your language. And this is exactly what Nelson Mandela meant by this. And he was a man who spoke many, many languages, and not just his friends. He also spoke Afrikaans, for example, because he knew how important it was to communicate on that personal level with people. So in addition to the purely commercial reasons, we want to localize so we can engage with our fans and our community on that personal level and show them that we respect them and that we care about them. And this is one of the reasons that we're even able to crowdsource localizations, because we have fan groups who are so passionate about our games, which is a wonderful thing. So let's get right into the technical jargon, shall we? And I've gone one slide. Here we go. So if you're as old as I am and you grew up in the days of MS-DOS and Windows 3.1, you remember a time when file names could only be so long. So if you ever run into these strange little abbreviations like T8N, L10N, G11N, or I18N, they're just old programmer shorthand for translation, localization, globalization, and internationalization. So, getting right to it, what's translation? We all know what translation is. That's that terrible thing we had to do in school where our teacher would demand one-for-one translations, replace the exact word with the exact word. There's no room for creativity or artistic interpretation. It's simply decoding the meaning in the source language and recoding it in the target language. Translation is what machines can do. That's why there's a Google Translate, but there's not a Google Localize. Machines can't localize yet. Localization requires an in-depth knowledge of the target culture in order to correctly adapt the product to make it seem locally authentic with a special understanding of the customer. So what's that mean exactly? Well, go back here a moment. I don't know if you see what I did there with those quotation marks. That's different. Period inside the quotation, outside the quotation. It's just one of those little differences that make the difference between seeming authentic and looking like it's definitely come from somewhere else. And that's where we get the disconnect with the customer that we want to avoid. So, moving forward, what are internationalization and globalization as they apply to what we do in the video games industry? Internationalization is being mindful of the global audience during the design phase and adopting a sustainable framework and terminology to avoid these pitfalls. So, for example, if I were designing the Simpsons television show, again, I make certain design decisions differently if I knew that this was something that I wanted to sell in the Arabic market or the Chinese market. But in a lot of cases, it's something that just is an indie hit that goes worldwide and suddenly they want to sell it everywhere. Some things you can do that with, and some things you can't. And that brings us to globalization. Globalization is the confluence of localization and internationalization. If you want your product to work, you have to manage your localization, but you also have to plan with internationalization in mind. And we're lucky enough in the video games industry that we are often less artistically driven and more driven by game design or storytelling, so that we can make internationalization decisions more easily. I saw one game during the judging for the competition which was excellent, which would have required very little localization simply because most of the narrative was picture-based. It was ingenious and I loved it. I believe it was Shapik the Moon Quest, so shout out to them. So yes, that is what these strange terms that you may see thrown around mean. Internationalization, globalization, translation, localization. And while this graphic isn't exactly pretty, it does sum up what I've just been talking about. And we can certainly return to it if we have time and if there's any desire on anybody's part. But yes, this essentially shows the confluence of those forces of localization, or rather of internationalization and localization and the globalization process. So, moving right along, just to recap, why do we localize? Well, it's to find a wider market for our games, first of all. If people can understand it, then they are more likely to buy it. Second, we enhance the experience by speaking to the gamer's heart. We really connect with them, and we do that by connecting in their native language. And when we do that, we create a more immersive game world. And we break a barrier between us and the customer, which, as a result, delights our fan community. One of the biggest compliments we've gotten as a studio is that people thought we were a German studio. That's how well our product had been localized. So that's really kind of the goal here, is to blend in, and that's why we localize. Where do we localize? Pretty much everywhere. All the game text needs to be localized. Burnt in text on images, which seems great when you're doing it, when you're not thinking from an international perspective, but is incredibly problematic down the line. You want to avoid any burnt in text on images whenever possible. The FAQ, the game manual, the wiki is naturally something that you'll need to include to be localized. Any web assets, is there a separate website? Is there a landing page? Is there an account management page? All these things need to be localized too. Marketing, advertisements. I've been asked many times, hey, what's play for free in German? And then the other thing is audio assets or subtitles. If your game has audio assets or has speech, this is something you're going to have to think about having localized or having subtitled. So, let's just see how I'm doing on time. So moving right along, how do we localize? Three main methods, depending on the size of your studio. You can do an outside vendor, an in-house community manager, or crowdsource directly from your fans. Personally, working with a reliable outside vendor is a wonderful thing. I can't say enough good things about the vendor that I've worked with for years over at Localize Direct and manager Michael. And they take care of everything. They typically offer you a software platform where you can centralize all of the assets that need to be localized, and they handle everything for you. That being said, there is, of course, a higher cost than if you were to have a solo translator, or perhaps somebody who already works in QA or as a community manager do the translation for you. The third option, if you're completely indie, or a lot of the times there will be a niche language, like Icelandic, or I don't want to insult anybody, but a niche language where there aren't that many speakers and where it's unlikely that the studio is going to ever pay to have a professional translation, but you're a fan and you'd like to see it in your native language. You can always ask the studio if they have some way of offering you an option of translating the game yourself. And tools that are integrated with Unity, such as i2, for example, is one that we're using on our new project. Romans is a wonderful tool. Can't say enough good things about it, and it integrates right with Google Sheets. So that is yet another route to go down. So moving along to the next slide here. When do we localize? Well, once all the text has been finalized in the primary language, whatever language that is, or as close to finalized as it will be. If you've got a product like ours, like a MMO, it's constantly evolving, constantly changing, and that's where what we talked about, internationalization, comes in, where this needs to be thought about during the development process. But once the game is as final as can possibly be, the localization manager will review all of the text in context. This means actually sitting down and playing the game with particular attention to spelling, style, grammar, punctuation, size. Some languages are longer than others, and just general comprehension. If the game isn't correct in the source language, it's much more difficult to ensure that it's going to be correct in the target languages. And so the localization manager will make corrections and suggests internationalization improvements. They'll typically review that with the design team. Once everybody's happy with it, the text will be sent off for localization. So I just mentioned the localization manager, and that is the person who manages the localization process. The localization manager oversees the basic and central stages of the process, which then enable all the others. Ideally, it's going to be somebody who's close to the design team and to the QA team, because there is quite a lot of QA involved in localization, both before and after. And the localization manager is also responsible for things such as the glossary of terms, maintaining the continuity of terminology. If you're always going to call it a tunic or a shirt, these sorts of things. It's some larger studios, larger corporations, even this is a full-time job. at other smaller development studios, this can be just one of the many hats that you wear. So whether you're looking for somebody internally or externally, helpful skills in a localization manager. You have to have exceptional writing and translating skills in at least 2 major world languages. I got roped into the role because I'm fluent in English and German, and pretty decent in French. Somebody with attention to the finer details of capitalization, punctuation, inflection, and also ensuring that those are carried over into the localized assets, which can be challenging, but necessary. And of course, passion for the art of games, because this isn't just one-for-one translation. There is a certain degree of creative interpretation and artistic license when we localize. There's needs to be in order to fit it to the target culture. So what does the localization manager actually do? Well, without getting overly technical, because I know we have to stay within some time constraints, bullet points. The localization manager will just receive the assets that need to be localized. Typically text strings. You'll have to convert the assets. You'll have to coordinate that sometimes. And then, best of all, you get to communicate with the translators. Because the translators need context a lot of the time. And then once we actually receive them back, make sure that they're accurate, make sure that they're suitable, make sure that the text hasn't overrun, and respond to QA feedback, because when QA tests this in additional languages, you might notice something in Chinese that just hadn't popped up, or let's say you're going very exotic and it's a language like Arabic that's read in the opposite direction. There's all sorts of things that only come out in QA, so you'll have to respond to that, and oftentimes it means repeating the entire process. And part of the localization manager's job is to ensure that that process is as smooth as possible and that there's as little waste as possible, that things aren't translated over and over again, that duplicate translations aren't requested, things like this. And I briefly touched on communicating with the translators, which kind of brings me to the last part of my presentation, which is some of the best questions that I've received from the translators in the 13 languages that we've translated Stronghold Kingdoms into. Top of the list has to be, what are feet? Well, this seems fairly obvious to most of us, but in Japanese there actually is not a word that corresponds to feet. I had to explain the context. I had to provide a screenshot in this case. It was for the avatar selector. It said feet. They're the things that are at the ends of your legs, as shown here in the screenshot. What is Weirguild? I didn't even know what this was. I needed to go to the design team and ask them, what is this? Once again, this is a very obscure term, since we are a medieval strategy game. We are going to have quite a few of these. This was one of them, and Weirguild is essentially money that you were paid for killing bandits or renegades. The translators had to be a little creative when translating that into their local languages if they didn't have a similar practice from a similar period in their history. Likewise, what is a house? Well, unfortunately in our game, a house can be two things. It can be either a dwelling where people live, or a royal family or a group of families that you belong to, like a royal house. And whereas these are sometimes different words in other languages, they're just the same word in English. So oftentimes I have to go in and make notes for the translators and give them the correct context. In this context, we mean a house as the building that you sleep in. Likewise with stocks. In the Middle Ages, these were a punishment tool, in German known as the Pranger. Unfortunately, as part of the quality assurance, I go through and I check this, and I see that the Pranger is called the Börse, which is the stock market. Totally different things. So it's these kind of questions that sometimes don't even get asked that you need to be on top of, be like, I better explain what kind of stocks we mean there. And last but not least, I'd like to give just a small example of an internationalization concern we encountered, which was days ago. This is something that you see very popular in timelines. This happened 5 days ago, or 5 minutes ago, or 2 minutes ago. Somebody did this. Unfortunately, this doesn't work for all languages. So the way we had originally hard-coded it in English to be X days ago had to be adapted so that it could accommodate languages like German, where it comes before, where it would be vor 4 Tagen instead of 4 days ago. So I see that my time is running long. Hope I don't need to do another take on this, but maybe we'll see. And now I should be tuning in to answer your questions. So, question was, how does the localization manager understand that the localization is good in sense of stylistic, grammar, etc., if they don't speak the target language? Excellent question. I'm lucky enough to be competent in a few languages like French and Spanish that I can have a general idea, but it's an excellent question. What do I do for languages like Chinese or Russian, where I'm kind of lost? Well, this is where we rely heavily on the fan community, and it's important to listen to feedback not just from QA, but also potentially from support, potentially from your player forums, because they will be very vocal usually about it. You know, there's something wrong and it bugs them. They will tell you, and you should believe them. And depending on the vendor you're working with, you know, maybe they are specialized and they only do video games, or maybe they're not, and it's possible to get varying qualities in translation. So that's why it is important to be mindful of the feedback that you're getting about that localization.
Okay. Well, that's answer. For now, we are waiting for another questions, but I also have a question for you.
Sure.
I have to work with localizations sometimes, although I'm a game designer, but well, you know how it goes. Sometimes I have to prepare context for some of my content, you know, and sometimes I meet like super weird questions from translators, and I never know how to prepare good enough. So I would decrease the number of these questions. Like sometimes, like for example, German people, they asked me once if I mean, like there was like the wall, and they mean, what do you mean by the wall? Is it the wall inside of the building or outside of the building? Because we have different words for this.
Well, I've noticed that in Russian and German, like there's words like zamok in Russian.
Yeah.
It can be what I would think of as a lock or what I would think of as a castle. It's actually exactly the same in German. A Schloss can be either a lock or a castle.
Yeah. Yeah.
And my language is even worse. I'm just so lucky that I grew up speaking this language. I would never be able to learn English if I learned German. That was easy. But, yeah. We have another question.
Yeah.
So
the question is, how do you automatize the process of localization?
That's a good question. We actually don't focus too much on automation and localization because we prefer that kind of human quality. That's really what you're paying for when you get it done by a localization service with human translators. And like I said, machine translation is great in terms of producing that understanding immediately, as in, okay, I got the idea, but that's not exactly how a person would say that. It might convey the idea, but you're not getting that human feeling to it. And so that's where any kind of automatic or machine-assisted translation is still lacking. I think we're going to get there, though. I'm a little worried. I spent more time learning computer languages than human languages.
Okay.
We have another one.
Yeah. Wait a second, I will translate it. Which services do for search of translators do you use?
Yes, well, we work with one single vendor. We've developed a good relationship with them over the years, and they do the work on all our titles, which is good because that means that we can maintain continuity. It's the same translators working on things, and plus they've got all of our notes from the previous translations. Any question that I've answered for any translator in the past is there. So yeah, it's important that you do take your translation work seriously and don't really do it piecemeal. It's good to realize that this is an essential part of connecting with customers. It's something you're always going to be doing. So you should choose a very reliable partner that you plan on working with and having a relationship with for many years to come. I love your cat. Mine, he just walked.
Yeah, he was making some noise, so I had to take him. Okay, so I don't see if we have any other questions for now. So I guess as we are already a little bit late, we are going to stop right there.
Sure, it's 5 a.m. here. I'm happy to go back to bed for a little while.
Thank you very much for your tips, for your speech. It was nice. And bye-bye.
Bye.